Before you continue reading, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to share will fundamentally alter your understanding of one of the most pivotal moments in American history. I've wrestled with this information for over 2 decades. The weight of it has cost me my marriage, my relationship with my children, my career, and quite possibly what little time I have left. My oncologist gives me 4 months. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer doesn't negotiate, which is why I'm finally breaking my silence. When you no longer fear professional repercussions or personal threats, the truth becomes your only remaining obligation. My name is Colonel Thomas Garrett, United States Air Force, retired. For 27 years, I served my country honorably, including 14 years in various Pentagon positions within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. On September 11, 2001, I was serving as Deputy Director of Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, a position that placed me in the chain of command for sensitive counterterrorism operations. I held TS-SCI clearance with access to Umbra, Keyhole, and Talent K-Hole compartments. This is not information I share lightly, but it's necessary context for what follows. I was in the Pentagon when American Airlines Flight 77 hit the western face of the building. I felt the impact reverberate through the reinforced concrete, witnessed the chaos that followed, helped pull injured colleagues from smoke-filled corridors. The official narrative of that day, 19 al-Qaeda operatives hijacking 4 commercial aircraft in a coordinated attack, is one that most Americans have accepted without question. 3 of those planes reached their targets. United Airlines Flight 93 didn't, officially due to the heroic actions of passengers who fought back against the hijackers. That's a story we've all been told. It's the story I helped perpetuate. But it's not the complete truth. Flight 93 was indeed targeted for destruction that morning, but not for the reasons stated in the 9/11 Commission report. What I'm about to reveal will sound impossible, even delusional. I understand the skepticism you'll feel. In your position, I would feel the same. All I ask is that you read this account in its entirety before passing judgment. The events I'm about to describe began approximately 20 minutes after the second plane hit the South Tower of the World Trade Center. By this point, the Pentagon had entered crisis mode. The National Military Command Center was fully activated, and the Secretary of Defense was being continuously briefed on developing events. I was stationed in a secure communications room adjacent to the NMCC when I received a direct call from General Warren Hendricks, then serving as Deputy Commander of the U.S. Strategic Command. What he said in those few terse sentences would set in motion the most classified operation of that infamous morning. Colonel Garrett, this is Shockwave. Authentication code. Echo Tango Sierra 79 We have a Skyfall contingency. I repeat, Skyfall is in effect. Report to Secure Briefing Room Delta immediately. Skyfall was not a standard military contingency code. It wasn't listed in any of the crisis response protocols I had memorized throughout my career. But I recognized it immediately as one of several ultra-black designations, operations so classified that their very existence was known only to a handful of individuals within the Department of Defense and Intelligence community. These were contingencies developed for scenarios deemed too sensitive or destabilizing for conventional military channels. I made my way to the briefing room, located in a sub-basement level of the Pentagon rarely accessed except by authorized personnel. Inside were 4 individuals: General Hendricks, appearing via secure video link; Dr. Eleanor Whitman, a senior scientist from DARPA; CIA Deputy Director Robert Keller; and Marine Colonel James Mattis, commander of a specialized tactical unit I had never previously encountered. General Hendricks wasted no time. Gentlemen, Dr. Whitman, as of 0937 hours, we have confirmation that the contents of Osiris have been compromised. Tracking indicates the package is on board United Airlines Flight 93, currently airborne, and en route to Washington, D.C. Dr. Whitman pulled up a secure terminal and displayed what appeared to be real-time tracking data of the flight. The specialized containment unit is showing signs of integrity failure, she said, her voice clinical, but unable to fully mask her tension. Readings indicate exposure may have already occurred among passengers. "What's Osiris?" I asked, feeling immediately out of my depth, but knowing I needed to understand the situation rapidly. The look exchanged between Keller and Whitman sent a chill down my spine. It was Keller who responded, choosing his words with deliberate care. "Colonel, Osiris is a biological research initiative begun in 1994 under the auspices of Advanced Pathogen Defense Studies. The project was compartmentalized even beyond special access programs. In simple terms, the research involves biological material of non-standard origin." "Non-standard meaning what exactly?" I pressed. "Non-terrestrial," Dr. Whitman interjected flatly. The specimens were recovered during a classified operation in Kazakhstan following the Soviet collapse. They were being transported to a secure facility within Mount Weather when the current situation developed. I remember staring at her, waiting for some indication that this was an elaborate training scenario. None came. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the electronic hum of equipment. "The specimens are inactive under normal conditions," Whitman continued, "but preliminary data suggests that a hijacker may have breached the containment protocols, possibly intentionally. We're detecting biometric anomalies among passenger vitals that are consistent with exposure." "Jesus Christ," I whispered, the full implications beginning to dawn on me. "You're telling me we have an unknown pathogen of extraterrestrial origin loose on a commercial airliner headed for D.C.? General Hendricks' voice cut through the secure channel. "That's precisely what we're telling you, Colonel, and why Skyfall has been activated. That plane cannot be allowed to reach its destination or crash in a populated area. The risk of widespread contamination is unacceptable." "What about the passengers?" I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it spoken aloud. "Telemetry suggests exposure is already at critical levels," Dr. Whitman replied, her scientific detachment slipping just slightly. "The most recent transmissions from the onboard monitoring systems indicate rapid physiological changes. These people are already compromised." Keller placed a sealed folder on the table. "Colonel Garrett, you are hereby tasked with executing Skyfall protocols. The aircraft must be neutralized over a remote area. A specialized intercept team will secure the crash site and implement containment procedures." I opened the folder. Inside was a direct presidential finding authorizing the use of deadly force against a civilian aircraft, signed not that morning, but 3 years earlier. This contingency had been anticipated, planned for. "This is why Flight 93 went down in Pennsylvania," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "It wasn't passenger heroism. We shot it down." "The official narrative serves national security interests," Keller replied without emotion, "and protects the public from a truth they cannot be prepared for." Within minutes, I was on a secure line to Andrews Air Force Base, where F-16s had already been scrambled in response to the attacks. Using authentication codes provided in the Skyfall packet, I redirected one of those fighters with new orders. The pilot was instructed to intercept Flight 93, and upon confirmation of specific coordinates over rural Pennsylvania, destroy the aircraft completely. The authorization came with strict communications protocols. No radio chatter, no questions. Immediate memory wipe of flight data recorders. At 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 plummeted from the sky near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The official investigation would later conclude that passengers had attempted to regain control of the aircraft from hijackers, causing the crash. In reality, the plane was brought down by an air-to-air missile fired by one of our own fighters, followed by a specialized ordnance designed to incinerate biological material at temperatures exceeding normal crash fires. Within 30 minutes of the crash, the first members of a specialized containment team were on site, dressed in hazard gear that would later be explained away as standard procedure for aviation disasters. What they recovered from that field was anything but standard. I was transported via military helicopter to the crash site 4 hours later. By then, a 2-mile perimeter had been established with a cover story about dangerous aviation fuel and debris. What I witnessed there haunts me to this day. The main debris field had been quickly contained under large military tents. Inside one of these structures, I observed the remains of a specialized containment unit, a hexagonal device approximately 1 meter in diameter, constructed of materials I didn't recognize. Parts of it had melted, but others remained intact despite the intense heat of the crash and subsequent fire. Dr. Whitman was already on site, directing a team of scientists in full biological containment suits far more advanced than typical hazmat gear. They were carefully collecting samples from both the device and what remained of the passengers. "What am I looking at?" I asked her as she stepped away from the collection team. "Evidence of partial biological integration," she responded clinically, though I could detect a tremor in her voice. The specimens were in a dormant state during transport, but the containment breach exposed them to conditions that triggered activation. We're seeing signs that the biological material had begun to interface with human tissue. Interface? What does that mean in plain English? She hesitated, seemingly weighing operational security against my need to understand the situation I was helping manage. The specimens possess unique properties that allow them to assimilate and reorganize biological material at the cellular level, she finally explained. In layman's terms, they don't just infect, they transform. The process appears to begin by altering neural tissue, specifically targeting the brainstem and limbic system. "You're describing some kind of parasite," I pressed. "Not precisely. Parasites exploit a host. This is more collaborative, or would be, if allowed to complete its process." The Kazakhstan specimens were recovered from a site dating back approximately 12,000 years. We believe they were deliberately sealed away by early human populations following an encounter that may have been the basis for certain mythological narratives of bodily possession. The implication struck me with nauseating clarity. The passengers were being taken over. Dr. Whitman nodded grimly. The telemetry from the containment unit showed accelerating biological processes. Based on the tissue samples we're recovering, the transformation was approximately 37% complete in the individuals nearest the breach. Another hour, and they would have landed in D.C., with the process at roughly 60% completion. And then what? Based on our laboratory models, the affected individuals would have appeared mostly normal, though with subtle behavioral changes. They would have dispersed from the aircraft and each become vectors for further transmission. The organism adapts extremely efficiently to its environment and host biology. I remember looking across the smoldering, the field, trying to process the magnitude of what I was being told. How many people would have been exposed? If they'd reached their target in the capital, potentially thousands within the first 24 hours, millions within weeks. The organism appears to generate specialized spores once integration reaches approximately 80% completion. That evening, I was present for the first interagency briefing on the containment operation. Representatives from the CDC, FEMA, and National Security Council had been brought into the Skyfall Circle of Knowledge, each selected for specific expertise and, most importantly, proven discretion on sensitive matters. NSC Deputy Director Philip Rain summarized the situation with brutal efficiency. As of 1800 hours, we have confirmed total containment of all biological materials at the crash site. Specialized decontamination procedures are underway. All recovered materials are being transported to a secure facility at Fort Detrick for analysis and controlled study. The official investigation into the crash of Flight 93 will conclude that the aircraft went down due to passenger intervention against hijackers. And the families of the victims, I asked. They will be informed that their loved ones died as heroes preventing another attack on Washington, Rain replied. Which, in a manner of speaking, is entirely true. What about the fighter pilot who actually shot down the plane? Asked Dr. Sarah Chen from the CDC. That's a significant loose end. Keller's response came without hesitation. The pilot has been debriefed under specialized protocols. He believes he was flying a classified training exercise that morning that was later canceled due to the attacks. His aircraft records have been modified to show he never left a patrol circuit over the Atlantic. The thoroughness of the deception was breathtaking. I had participated in classified operations throughout my career, but never anything approaching this level of compartmentalization and cover-up. I have one more question, I said, looking directly at Dr. Whitman. Where exactly did these specimens come from? You mentioned Kazakhstan and non-terrestrial origin. I need to understand what we're dealing with. The tension in the room rose perceptibly. After a long pause, Dr. Whitman responded. In 1994, a joint Russian-American scientific team investigating the site of the 1908 Tunguska event discovered unusual material embedded deep within the permafrost. The material had properties inconsistent with any known terrestrial biology. Analysis suggested it predated the Tunguska explosion by thousands of years, but had been brought closer to the surface by the impact. Subsequent investigations revealed similar materials at a site in Kazakhstan. You're saying these are extraterrestrial biological agents? Dr. Chen asked incredulously. We believe they originated outside our solar system. Yes, Whitman confirmed. But they may have reached Earth thousands of years ago. The evidence suggests multiple contact points throughout human prehistory. There are references in ancient Sumerian texts to entities that could wear men-like garments. Similar descriptions appear in pre-dynastic Egyptian hieroglyphs and certain obscure Sanskrit manuscripts. This is insane, I remember saying, though the evidence before me left little room for denial. Why was this material being transported on a commercial flight? The glance exchanged between Keller and Whitman told me everything I needed to know before either spoke. It wasn't supposed to be, Keller finally admitted. The specimens were being transported via military aircraft from our research facility in Colorado to Mount Weather. The transport was redirected mid-flight due to a security breach at the destination facility. Redirected to what? United 93? To a secure airfield in New Jersey. The containment unit was to be transferred to a waiting military vehicle. The hijacking was an unforeseen complication. Unforeseen? I was nearly shouting now. You're telling me Al-Qaeda coincidentally hijacked the exact commercial flight carrying extraterrestrial biological material. What are the odds? The room fell silent again, the implication of my question hanging in the air. It was Dr. Whitman who finally addressed it. We don't believe it was coincidental, Colonel. Preliminary analysis suggests the hijackers may have been specifically targeting the containment unit. We're still determining how they knew it would be on that flight. Are you suggesting the hijackers knew what they were after? That this was about releasing this organism, not crashing planes into buildings? We can't rule out the possibility, Keller replied carefully. Though whether the hijackers understood the true nature of what they were attempting to release is another question entirely. They may have simply been told it was a biological weapon. Over the following weeks, I was deeply involved in the Skyfall containment operation. The public story of Flight 93 crystallized around the heroic Let's Roll narrative, passengers sacrificing themselves to prevent another attack on Washington. Meanwhile, a very different operation was unfolding behind the scenes. The crash site was subjected to decontamination protocols far beyond standard procedure. The entire area was excavated to a depth of 20 feet, with all soil removed for specialized processing. Groundwater was monitored continuously for contamination. The official debris recovery operation concealed a much more thorough archaeological-style excavation, with every fragment catalogued and tested for biological residue. Most disturbing were the remains of the passengers themselves. Those seated nearest the cargo hold, where the containment unit had been stored, showed the most advanced signs of biological alteration. Tissue samples revealed cellular changes that defied conventional medical understanding. Human cells transformed into hybrid structures with properties more similar to a colonial organism than individual human biology. 3 weeks after the crash, I was summoned to a classified debriefing at Pentagon Special Access Facility 23, an underground complex rarely acknowledged, even within the defense community. Present were several figures from the original Skyfall briefing, along with 2 individuals I had never seen before, introduced only by single initial designations. Colonel Garrett, began the man identified only as M. Your service during this crisis has been exemplary. However, we've reached the point where your continued involvement is no longer necessary. With respect, sir, I countered, I'm deeply embedded in the containment and investigation protocols. My sudden removal would create operational inefficiencies. That's not our primary concern, replied M, his tone making it clear that my argument was futile. What matters now is knowledge compartmentalization. Too many people are already aware of certain aspects of Skyfall. That circle needs to contract, not expand. I understood immediately what was happening. I was being pushed out of the operation because I knew too much. Too much about the specimens. Too much about the cover-up. Too much about the questions surrounding how the hijackers had known about the containment unit. You'll be reassigned to counterterrorism analysis for the conventional 9/11 response, Keller explained. A position of significant importance, particularly with your background. Your service record will show an exceptional contribution to national security during this crisis. And if I have concerns about certain aspects of Skyfall, I asked, careful to maintain a neutral tone despite my growing unease. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Colonel, said the woman identified only as L, speaking for the first time. I'm sure I don't need to explain the sensitivity of this matter. The continuity of our civilization depends on certain truths remaining contained as effectively as the biological samples themselves. It wasn't a threat, not explicitly, but the message was unmistakable. I was to forget what I had seen and learned, to accept the reassignment and the official narrative, to become complicit in the lie. For 13 years, I did exactly that. I buried myself in conventional counterterrorism work, advanced through the ranks, received commendations for operations that now seem trivial compared to what I knew was hidden from the public. I got up each morning, put on my uniform, and played my role in the machinery of national security. The nightmares began almost immediately. Dreams of being at the crash site, watching as partially transformed bodies pulled themselves from the wreckage, reaching for me with limbs that were no longer entirely human. In these dreams, I could see the intelligence behind their eyes, something ancient and patient and utterly alien looking out through human faces. Sometimes I would wake up convinced that the transformation was beginning in my own body, checking my skin for signs of the cellular changes I had seen in the laboratory reports. My marriage didn't survive. How could it? I couldn't tell my wife what was really haunting me, why I woke up screaming, why I insisted on elaborate decontamination routines before entering our home. She eventually concluded I was suffering from PTSD related to the Pentagon attack, a convenient explanation that doctors readily endorsed. The medications they prescribed did nothing for the real source of my distress. In 2014, I made a critical mistake. After several drinks at a secure intelligence community function, I approached Dr. Whitman, who had continued her work on the specimens, and asked about the progress of the research. It was an innocent question on its face, but we both knew what I was really asking. Had they determined the true nature and origin of the organisms? Had they learned how the hijackers knew about the shipment? Her response was a carefully constructed non-answer about advancements in pathogen research, but her eyes conveyed a warning. The next day, I was informed that my security clearance was being reviewed due to concerns about alcohol consumption. Within a week, I was transferred to a position that effectively removed me from any access to sensitive information. 6 months later, a medical evaluation conveniently discovered early signs of coronary disease, leading to a strongly encouraged early retirement. The message was clear. I had been allowed to step back from the edge once. There would not be a second chance. I settled into retirement, bought a small house in rural Virginia, and tried to forget. For a time, it seemed possible. The nightmares became less frequent. I established routines that brought some semblance of normality. I even began dating again, though I never allowed anyone to get too close. Then 3 years ago, something happened that shattered my carefully constructed peace. A package arrived at my home. No return address, no markings of any kind. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note that simply read, "You're not alone in knowing." They've continued the research. What happened on Flight 93 was just the beginning. The drive contained hundreds of classified documents, research reports, field notes, personnel files, all related to what was now being called Project Osiris. The material spanned from 2001 to 2018, revealing that far from being contained and destroyed, the biological specimens recovered from Flight 93 had become the centerpiece of an extensive black research program. Most disturbing were the records detailing controlled exposure experiments conducted on unwitting human subjects, terminal patients in military hospitals, prisoners in black sites, even voluntary military personnel who believed they were participating in routine vaccine studies. The research had progressed from understanding the organisms to attempting to control and direct the transformation process they initiated. The files revealed something even more troubling. The researchers had confirmed that the organism had been on Earth for thousands of years, with evidence of previous release events throughout human history. Certain historical accounts of possession, parasitic control, and changelings were being re-examined as possible documentation of previous encounters with the organism. The research team had identified genetic markers in approximately 0.01% of the global population indicating ancestral exposure and partial biological integration. Humans who carried fragments of the alien biology in their DNA. Among these documents was a heavily redacted report addressing the question that had haunted me since 2001. How had the hijackers known about the specimens? The answer made my blood run cold. They hadn't been targeting the containment unit randomly, or even under the belief it was a conventional bioweapon. They had been directed to it by individuals already carrying the genetic markers of previous exposure. Individuals who believed they were preparing the way for a more complete integration between the organism and humanity. In other words, there were people, some in positions of considerable influence, who wanted the organism released, who believed its capacity to transform human biology was not a threat, but an opportunity, an accelerated evolution, a transcendence. I spent weeks analyzing the files, cross-referencing names, dates, and research milestones. I identified key personnel who had been involved in the program consistently since its inception. I mapped facilities where the research was being conducted, and I began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy. Not just to hide the truth about Flight 93, but to actively develop the organism's potential while maintaining absolute secrecy. I debated what to do with this information. Going public seemed impossible. Who would believe such an outlandish story? Approaching government oversight committees would only alert those involved that their security had been compromised. I finally decided to reach out to one name that appeared in the files, but seemed to be on the periphery of the research. Dr. Marcus Chen, a geneticist who had consulted on the project briefly before being removed, apparently for raising ethical concerns. It took me 2 months to track him down to a small research institute in Seattle. When I finally made contact, he agreed to meet only in a public location, a decision that likely saved my life. As we sat in a busy coffee shop, I carefully broached the subject of his work on unusual biological specimens during his time with DARPA. The blood drained from his face immediately. "Who are you?" he whispered, already gathering his belongings to leave. "Someone who was there when the specimens were recovered from Flight 93, I replied quietly. Someone who received information suggesting the research continued against all recommendations. He stared at me for a long moment, then set his bag down again. "What do you know about the integration initiative?" he asked. I shook my head. "Nothing. That term doesn't appear in the files I've seen." "Because it's not a formal program designation. It's what certain individuals involved in Osiris call their true objective." He leaned forward, voice barely audible above the coffee shop ambience. "They believe the organism represents the next step in human evolution. That integration with it would enhance human capabilities, extended lifespan, accelerated healing, possibly even forms of communication we currently can't comprehend. They want to be taken over by an alien parasite." I couldn't keep the incredulity from my voice. "They don't see it as parasitism. They see it as symbiosis. And they're working toward controlled, directed integration, rather than the random transformation that would have occurred on Flight 93. He glanced nervously around the coffee shop. I left when I realized their end goal wasn't defense against the organism, but weaponization and eventually distribution. Distribution? They want to expose the general population. Not immediately. The current phase involves creating a small population of fully integrated individuals, people who have undergone the complete transformation process under controlled conditions. These subjects would retain their human appearances and identities while gaining the organism's capabilities. "How far have they progressed?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. When I left 3 years ago, they had achieved approximately 40% integration in volunteer subjects without compromising cognitive function or external appearance. The subjects reported enhanced sensory perception, accelerated healing, and, most significantly, a form of limited communication with other integrated individuals that resembled telepathy. We spoke for nearly 2 hours. Dr. Chen filled in gaps in my understanding, explaining how the research had evolved from containment to exploitation. He confirmed my worst fears, that there were individuals at the highest levels of government and military who saw the organism not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a means of creating enhanced human assets for intelligence and military applications. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Chen handed me a small data card. "This contains addresses for secure communication channels if you need to contact me again. But I strongly advise against pursuing this further. They monitor everyone who's had contact with the program, even peripheral consultants like me." "I've been living with this knowledge for 20 years, I replied. "I can't just walk away now that I know it's ongoing." "You misunderstand," he said grimly. "I'm not concerned about your mental well-being. I'm concerned about your survival. 3 former researchers who raised objections have died in accidents in the past year alone. Another disappeared completely. They protect the secret, absolutely." 3 days after meeting Dr. Chen, I returned home to find my house had been searched. The intrusion was professional. Nothing obviously disturbed, but small signs visible to someone with my training. The USB drive, which I had hidden in a waterproof container buried beneath my garden shed, remained secure. But the message was clear. I was being watched. 2 weeks later, Dr. Chen was killed in what police described as a carjacking gone wrong. No suspects were ever identified. The secure communication channels he had provided went dark simultaneously. I was on my own. For the next year, I lived in a state of constant vigilance, relocating frequently, using cash instead of cards, avoiding digital communications. I reached out to former colleagues who I thought might be sympathetic, but found doors closed, calls unreturned. I had become radioactive, someone to be avoided. Whether from fear or complicity, no one would engage with my concerns. Then came the diagnosis: Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, already metastasized to the liver. The oncologist gave me the standard reassurances about treatment options, but we both knew the prognosis. I had months, not years. The diagnosis should have devastated me. Instead, it brought clarity. With my death sentence pronounced by natural causes, the need to silence me became less urgent. More importantly, I no longer had anything to lose. I began compiling everything I knew: the original Skyfall operation, the specimens recovered from Flight 93, the subsequent research program, the integration initiative. I combined my first-hand knowledge with the documents from the anonymous USB drive, creating a comprehensive account of a 20-year conspiracy to not only hide the truth about an extraterrestrial biological entity, but to actively develop its potential for human integration. What I've shared here is only a fraction of that account. The full documentation, including names, dates, facility locations, and research milestones, has been entrusted to multiple individuals with instructions for release in the event of my accidental death or disappearance. It includes DNA samples from my own body, which I believe may show traces of exposure from my time at the crash site, despite the decontamination protocols. Why am I coming forward now, after all these years of silence? Because the integration initiative is approaching a critical threshold. According to the most recent files in my possession, they have achieved 85% biological integration in controlled subjects without compromising human cognitive function or appearance. These individuals, I hesitate to still call them entirely human, are being prepared for placement in strategic positions throughout government, military, and key private sector organizations. The files indicate a planned limited distribution phase, scheduled to begin within the next 5 years. The controlled integration of up to 10,000 carefully selected individuals, creating a network of enhanced operatives loyal to the program's objectives. This network would then guide broader integration over subsequent decades, fundamentally altering humanity's biological nature, without most people ever realizing what was happening. I don't know if I'll live long enough to see the beginning of this phase. My condition progresses daily, but I can no longer remain silent about what Flight 93 was really carrying, why it had to be destroyed, and how the organism it contained has become the focus of the most dangerous research program in human history. If you're reading this, you now share the burden of this knowledge. I don't ask you to believe me without question. Skepticism is appropriate for claims of this magnitude, but I urge you to look beyond the official narratives, to question why certain aspects of the Flight 93 crash remain classified even decades later, to notice the patterns of unusual research funding and unexplained deaths among certain scientific specialists. The truth about what happened on September 11, 2001, is more complex and more terrifying than most could imagine. What crashed in that Pennsylvania field was not just an aircraft brought down to prevent another target from being hit. It was the first battle in a silent war for humanity's future. A war most people don't even know is being fought, and we may already be losing. Colonel Thomas Garrett, USF, returned March 17, 2023.